Hello everybody, I hope all my lovely psychology students are doing well. Right, let's do a little bit of marking. I want to work through this one. It was your sound test task number 2 that you had to do. So let's make sure if you haven't got it with you, let's pause. You did this in week number 8 and we're going to do some marking. When you mark this, I would like you to award it a mark. Give a justification. Why did you give it that mark? And if you didn't get full marks, what do you need to add in to get those full marks? Remember, let's use a different color so that it stands out so that you can clearly see how to make these improvements. So let's start off. Here we have our STEM and our data table. Now, just a bit of an exam hint here. When you in research methods, you will always get nice big chunky, well, majority of times, a chunky stem. Now, we will do a session on this, but take the time to annotate it. What do you identify in it? Because it will save you time in the future in the exam. So for example, read through what's the IV, what's the DEV, what research type method, and what design is it having is, what is it telling us? Just make these little annotations. So if you do get a question on identifying what the IV is and the operalyzed DV is, you can just look at your annotation and say, oh, it's right there, and it saved you a little bit of time, but we'll do a session on that. So I'm sure you've read this, I'm not going to read it through to you, so let's move on to our first question. Explain 2 factors that the researcher had to take into account when deciding to use the sign test. Refer to the investigation above in your answer, 4 marks. Now, let's understand the question. It's asking for an explanation because one of our command words is an explain. It's looking for 2 factors. Okay, so these are the justifications that we need to use why we would choose. Remember, there's 3 of those justifications why we would choose the sign test. But the question is also asking you to do another thing. It's asking you to refer to the investigation above in your answer. Now, refer to is application, right? So it's giving us, it's saying, well, half of the marks are going to be down to application. So it's asking us for each factor to do 2 things. It's asking you to explain the relevant factor for the choice and apply it. So that's why your STEM is really important. So when we look at the mark allocation, 4 marks. Each one is worth 2 marks because they're looking for 2 factors. One is for the factor and its explanation, and the other mark is for its application to the STEM. That's why it is important to take time to understand the STEM. So this question is both AO1 and AO3. So let's look at how we get 2 marks. Right, I'm going to be doing it for the explanation, then the application. 2 factors that are relevant to the use of the sign test, so we know what they are. Nominal data, test of difference, and repeated measures. So just put it into a sentence. Because remember, it is saying explain. So the sign test uses nominal data that can only be placed into categories. It's looking for a test of difference between 2 things. Or it's repeated measure design, participants do all the conditions. There you go, straightforward. Doesn't need to be long and complicated. Now, for the 2 that you've identified, you've now got to apply, and this is how you get your 2nd mark, right, is for the applications. So nominal data, and this is where the STEM is really important. Nominal data is as patients are assigned to one of 3 categories: improved, deteriorated, or neither. You've got to include those. There's your application. Actually, it's in the STEM. If you did test for a difference in the number of absences in the year following and prior to the treatment, so before and after the treatment. Okay, so we're showing where we're looking for the difference, and repeated measures as the same patient's work records are compared before and after the treatment. So if you did repeated measures design, this is, so for example, you could have wrote it like this. Repeated measures design is when the same participants are used in all conditions as they were looking at the same patient's work records before and after the treatment, and they compared these. There you go. You could have done it in one sentence. There gets you your 2 marks. The factor with a little bit of an explanation and the application. So pause here and mark yours. Remember, read it through, identify, have you got an explain of the factor and an application? And if you haven't, annotate in, give yourself a mark and a justification for that mark. Pause here. Question B, calculate the sign test value of S for the data in table 1. Explain how you reached your answer. Again, let's understand the question. First sentence, calculate the sign test value of S in the data in table 1. So you've got to do that calculation, explain how you reached that answer. So again, the question is asking you to do 2 things. The calculation, so that you get the calculated value of S, and then it's asking you to explain how you reached your answer. Now, explain how. Explain means that it needs to be in words. It's not asking you to show your calculations, because then you just show how you calculated it. In this question is explain how. So it's asking you to explain, remember how, what would you actually do in words, how you would do it. You will not get marks if you just show the calculation. So 1 mark for the explanation, 1 mark for the calculation and how we arrived at it. So explain. The most commonly occurring sign is the plus, which is 12, and the least frequency occurring sign is the minus, which is 5, and zeros are disregarded. S will equal the least frequent sign. So I've answered the second part of the question. You don't need to do them in order, right? So we've explained how we have reached, and then we get 1 mark for stating what the calculated value, and the calculated value of S equals 5. So 1 mark for stating what the calculated value of mark is, 1 mark for explaining how. Remember, explain is in words. How would you go about it? What would you actually do? So it's really important that we can do that. Now, different color pen, mark your answer, give a mark, give a justification why you gave it that answer. If you are missing anything, annotate it in. Pause now. Our last question, C, that we're going to look at now with reference to the critical value tables in table 2, explain whether or not the value of S that you calculated in response to question B is significant at a 0.05 level for a 2-tailed hypothesis, 2 marks. So we're going to be using the critical value table that's on your right. Underneath it tells you the calculated value of S must be equal to or smaller than the critical value of S. So that's giving you what we're looking for as well. So let's look at our answer. Significance level was not found as the calculated value of S, which is 5, at 5%. Now, we get 1 mark for that. We've got to say, right, question B, the significance level, with reference to the critical value table, explain whether or not the value of S calculated in question is significant. So the question, that's what you've got to answer. Is it significant? Was there significance, sorry, rather than is there significance? Doesn't make sense. So let's get back to this. So let's tell them, was significance found or not? Significance was not found at the calculated value of S, which is 5 at 5% on P. So we're telling them it wasn't found using that data. Now we need to explain it further to get our second mark, as it is not equal to or smaller than the critical value of S, which is 4 when N equals 17. So when we use the critical value table, we know there's 17 participants, that's our N, so we need to put it in there. We can see it is 4, and therefore 5 is not equal to or smaller than 4, so we definitely know significance wasn't found. It's important for you to state, was significance found or not, and then explain why. Really important to be able to do that. Have you included all the appropriate pieces of information in your answer to get your 2 marks? Again, pause the video, annotate, mark, and give a justification. Right, nice short and sweet session. I hope it's starting to make sense, the sign test. The sign test is the only inferential statistical test that you could be asked to calculate from beginning to end because it's so easy. Because it's a very easy and quick calculation. So it's about really becoming aware of what you need to do. Make sure in your notes you've got a step-to-step account of what you do with regards to it, and then it's quite straightforward. So this is the only test that they can ask you to calculate from the start to the end. All the inferential other tests are more complicated and very time consuming. So they're not going to ask you to calculate the whole thing. So my lovelies, work well,